Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from a channel called JUCE, which I'm pretty sure was the channel called JUCE TV, which I visited a while ago. I haven't seen that channel in a long time.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time. A long time.
This video of theirs is called What's the Point of the Bible's Rules? And I thought it would be a nice follow-up to my Things That Don't Make Sense video from last week, as one of the things that I said didn't make sense was God's need for rituals for various forms of forgiveness and cleansing. I don't understand why all that rigmarole would be required for an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent creator God, so hopefully these guys can explain that to me today. Before we start though, just soak in the gloriousness that is my set, with its crooked shelves and exposed wires. This is the last video that will ever be recorded in front of the set, so it's time to bid it a very fond farewell. Anyway, on to the video.
Hey, time out. The only good thing in the world is the Bible. Patricia, that's a little goody two-shoesy, right? No, I agree with you. I think the Bible is good. But there's a lot of rules, wouldn't you say?
Fun fact. It isn't the fact that the Bible contains rules that makes it not good, it's that the rules it contains are not good. Like the ones that tell you where to buy slaves, for instance.
Hey everyone, my name is Josh. Welcome to Overtime, a series of videos where we look at some of the most popular comments in the comment section on our Time Out series, and we do a deep dive to unpack the discussion a bit more and have some dialogue. If you're a Christian watching this video, we hope you'll walk away feeling encouraged about your faith, and if you're not a Christian, we hope you'll at least better understand the positions we hold and why we believed it.
An admirable goal, and I appreciate that they don't claim to be trying to convert non-Christians. Most apologists make a show of, if not actively trying to convert non-Christians in the moment, using stories in their apologetics of a time when they conversed with an atheist and completely annihilated all their points, leaving them stunned, and then everybody clapped. So it is weirdly refreshing to hear someone just flat out say, yeah, this is to make Christians feel better about what they believe.
So today we're talking about the concept of the rules. If you're old enough to watch this video, you've probably heard about how Christianity is nothing but a bunch of rules, and Christians are a bunch of rule-enforcing hypocrites who are trying to make everyone live by their rules and ruin all of life's fun.
There's a lot to unpack here. Firstly, I'm not actually sure that that is even something that you'll hear about Christianity from non-Christians. I certainly thought that was the case when I was a Christian, but since becoming an atheist, I can't say that I've ever heard Christianity described that way by a non-Christian. So I think that might be one of those common straw man stories that preachers will tell. I mean, sure, there are atheists, myself included, who will add not having to worry about Sky Daddy watching your every move to a list of things that we enjoy about not being Christian, but that's not the defining trait of Christianity in my mind. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong here, but there's also the addition of the word hypocrites in there. He didn't explain, but I assume that that's with reference to the sorts of things that Christians preach against, but statistically do just as much as anyone else, like divorce. Divorce rates among Christians are about the same as they are among non-Christians, yet they will claim to believe that divorce is only allowed in one very specific scenario. There's a perception among non-Christians that Christians hold others to a higher standard than they are willing to hold themselves to. And really, what should we expect from the people who want to emulate the God of the Bible? They learned it from watching him.
I learned it by watching you.
Bible God says not to kill, but Bible God killed more people than any other character in the Bible. Bible God says not to lie, but Bible God lies to people on a regular basis. Bible God says to turn the other cheek and forgive those who wronged you, whether they ask or not. But Bible God will throw you into hell for the tiniest infraction if you don't beg him for forgiveness before you die. But then we also get the reference to the idea that Christians are trying to stop everyone from having fun. And yeah, a lot of them are. There are entire organizations dedicated to pressuring entertainment companies away from making stories involving non-Christian supernatural elements, away from including even the smallest references to LGBTQ people existing, away from including any references to any non-marital sex, and so on. It wouldn't be a big deal if they themselves would just not watch the media that they disapprove of, but they want it to not even be produced in the first place, so that even the people who disagree with them can't enjoy those sorts of stories. To be fair, it's still not a big deal because the vast majority of people, Christians included, aren't bothered by those sorts of things in movies and TV shows and often rather enjoy it, and the attempted boycotts are insignificant compared to how many people actually watch the stuff. But the point is that they try. They try to impose their ideas of what should and should not be considered fun onto other people, whether those people agree with them or not. So if you don't like that non-Christians see Christians as being a giant buzzkill, then maybe talk to the other Christians and convince them to not be giant buzzkills.
And it actually couldn't be further from the truth. for our lives in the New Testament.
So I'd like to again reference last week's video, as one of the points that I made was that Christianity calls Christians to live a life of sacrifice, but all the fun stuff that Christians are supposed to be sacrificing are things that they will claim to not want anyway. So to say that no, you're not actually sacrificing a fun life for Christianity is to acknowledge that being a Christian is not a sacrifice, even though the Bible very clearly spells out the idea that you aren't a true Christian unless you are living a life of sacrifice.
So first, let's start with the Old Testament commands, otherwise known as the Mosaic Law. Now, if you've ever read through the books of the Bible that are Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll notice that there are a bunch of commands or instructions that are given to the Israelite people for how they're supposed to live. From what they eat, to what they wear, how they dress, to how they interact with other people, it's all in there.
Yes. And that's where I spent most of my time talking about the rituals that God requires of his people. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense that a being like the God that Christians believe in would require the kind of hoop jumping that is described in the Old Testament.
And one of the other things that people will wonder about the most is how many laws or instructions are there, and if people are actually able to keep them all.
And that's another issue. According to modern Christianity, one single sin in your entire lifetime is enough to condemn you to hell. So we wind up in a situation where God has a bunch of rules that not only should he not actually need, but he also designed them to be impossible for anyone to actually follow to that degree, and anyone who fails to follow the impossible to follow laws get thrown into hell. And what's worse is that Christians will often say this as though it's a good thing. He made it impossible for us so that he could show off how merciful and forgiving he is when he does the whole Jesus thing and allows people to then be forgiven without jumping through a bunch of hoops first. It's kind of gross.
Basically, the Mosaic Law can be boiled down to a few certain ideas. You have the 10 Commandments, which everyone has probably heard of, and these are part of what's called the moral laws. And then you have social laws, food laws, purity laws. You have different ways to do feasts, sacrifices and offerings, instructions for the religious figures, and instructions on the tabernacle, and so on.
Yeah. Whole lot of senseless rigmarole, with barely a handful of decent moral laws thrown in to give Ray Comfort something to harp on. Also, I like that he chose an image of the binding of Isaac as a visual representation of the sacrifice laws. Most of the sacrifice laws in the Old Testament are regarding birds and livestock and things, so it would have been really easy to avoid drawing attention to the fact that Bible God sometimes accepted human sacrifice as well. Yeah, Isaac didn't end up dying in that particular story, but there are other stories, like Jephthah's daughter, where the child isn't so lucky.
So rabbinic interpretation, that is the way that the Jewish teachers think of the law, said that there are 613 specific instructions that the Jewish people are supposed to keep. Now, furthermore, parts of the Old Testament were passed down by word of mouth, which is often referred to as the oral Torah. Because after Solomon's temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, there's this distinctive shift that occurs in Judaism, which ends up birthing what we know today as Rabbinic Judaism.
And this is a point that I covered when responding to Sean McDowell a couple weeks ago. Modern Judaism, as we know it today, began around the same time as Christianity. As he mentioned, Rabbinic Judaism was a response to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and arguably, Christianity owes at least some of its early growth to that same event. It was the answer to the question of how you do all the temple sacrifices and whatnot without a temple. Christianity, in its infancy, was not a distinct religion from Judaism, it was a sect of Judaism. So the destruction of the temple didn't just birth Rabbinic Judaism, it also birthed Christianity.
Now, Rabbinic Judaism teaches and affirms that Moses presented the laws to the Jewish people, and that those laws don't all apply to the Gentiles, which we would be included in that as Christians today, with the exception of the 7 laws of Noah, which according to Jewish teaching applies to all of humankind. Most Christians believe that only parts dealing with the morality from the Mosaic Law versus civic or cultural still apply to us today. And some Christians think that none apply anymore, and a small minority of Christians think that they actually still all apply to us as believers.
Okay, but do you not see how the very fact that different Christians disagree about which laws apply today is a mark against Christianity? Like, these used to be supremely important rules where if you failed to follow them, you end up damned to hell. I mean, not really. The ancient Israelites didn't have the same concept of hell as modern Christians, but what the ancient Israelites believed has never stopped modern Christians from imposing their interpretation onto their text before, so I don't expect them to start now. But my point is that these are God's most important rules. You'd think that he could clarify whether or not they still apply in a way that all Christians could agree on. So the fact that there are at least 3 schools of thought on this supremely important matter counts against the truth of Christianity.
Jesus himself says that he didn't come to abolish the law of Moses. Rather, he came to fulfill it, like he says in Matthew 5:17.
Yeah. He said he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, following that up by saying, "Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." He then goes on to modify the old laws with the whole, "You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I say, even thinking someone is sexy is the same as sleeping with them" thing. Notably though, while most of this section could easily be seen as Jesus strengthening the old commandments by making them stricter, this is also the section where we find in verses 48 and 49, the turn the other cheek section. Again, he starts with the "you have heard that it was said" bit, this time referencing Leviticus 24:19 through 20, which says, "If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him." But instead of strengthening this one, he relaxes it. "You have heard the eye for eye thing said, yeah, but I say that if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek and invite them to hit you again, and do not retaliate." So Jesus affirms that everyone still needs to keep the Mosaic law, right before preaching that one particular Mosaic law is actually exactly backward and needs to be reversed. So I guess Jesus will be called least in the kingdom of heaven by his own metric?
First, it's important to recognize that the law meant to serve as a reality that as people, we on our own could not measure up.
Oh hey, it's that thing that I said earlier about how God gave us a law that is impossible to keep in order to remind us that we suck and need God to be merciful and forgiving. Not sure why Christians think this is a good thing, but here we are.
The Jews did the best they could, and they had teachers like the Pharisees who were there to guide them in that regard. However, they themselves still had a sacrificial system with a mediator between them and God. And the reason for this was because they still needed to have their sins atoned for.
But why, though? I mean, even if I grant that the sins do need to be atoned for, why is it through a blood sacrifice? The wages for sin are death, so something has to die because perfect justice, blah, blah, blah. I get that. But who decided that the wages for sin are death? Was that not God's choice? And really, modern Christians viscerally understand how horrible animal sacrifice is. That's why one of the tropes during the Satanic Panic was that Satanists are sacrificing neighborhood cats. How heinous and immoral to be sacrificing cats. Okay. Then why is the human sacrifice that serves as the basis for all of Christianity okay? And why were the sheep and goat sacrifices before then also okay? In our culture today, killing animals to appease a vengeful god is largely seen as a primitive superstitious practice. Obviously, we know now that killing animals won't bring rain to your crops or give calm seas for your voyage, but somehow Christians put that aside when talking about the animal sacrifices that appeased their vengeful god in the past, with stories in the Bible that are explicitly about how the failure of Israel to properly appease that god, leading to things like them being conquered or having bad harvests. I don't see a difference between the primitive superstitions leading to animal sacrifices and the ancient Israelite superstitions leading to animal sacrifices. So what is the functional difference there?
Now, when Jesus comes to fulfill the law, he's stating that he is going to be the perfect fulfillment of the Mosaic law.
I mean, he never actually said that. That is the Christian interpretation of what happened, but what he seems to actually mean when he says he came to fulfill the law is with regards to the rest of what he said after that statement. The whole, "this is the Old Testament thing, now I'm modifying it to mean this other thing." At least, that's what that statement would mean if you read it in context. He talks about fulfillment of the law right before talking about specific laws and then adding on to them. So it's not that he is the human embodiment of the fulfillment of the law. It is literally that the laws that he is talking about are completed now that he's added his corollaries to them.
He's going to be the one who keeps the intended spirit of the law and be that ultimate sacrifice.
But that's not how laws work. I mean, maybe in a corrupt system it is. Bribe an official that's high enough up in the food chain and they'll let you get away with anything. But the sense of justice that most people have would suggest that the person who committed the crime is the one who needs to be punished for that crime. Now, this same sense of justice would usually suggest that the death penalty for most crimes is not warranted. Even pro-death sentence people usually wouldn't call for execution in the cases of things like petty theft or speeding. But if someone were to commit a heinous murder, would anyone call it justice if a sheep were executed instead of the murderer and the execution of the sheep counted as all the atonement that was required, so now the murderer is free to go? Even if we step away from the death penalty, putting a sheep in prison for life without the possibility of parole and letting the murderer walk free since the sheep is atoning for their crime is pretty obviously a gross miscarriage of justice, is it not? Apologists will claim that this punishment by proxy is how God can simultaneously be perfectly just and perfectly merciful. Since mercy is the suspension of justice, those two traits cannot coexist in one being, so they externalize the justice part and pretend that justice by proxy is close enough that it counts, despite it being so obviously unjust that no human government has ever set up a system that would so easily allow anyone to escape all the consequences of any crime just through having an animal punished in their stead. And Christianity makes it worse. It is now no longer an animal sacrifice, but a human sacrifice. And despite this human sacrifice supposedly being to atone for all of humanity's sins, it only actually applies to people who know about it and accept it as such, with everyone else being shit out of luck. So this takes it from the realm of, I killed a sheep, can I go now, into, hey judge, I'm friends with your kid, can I go now? My point is that this is neither perfect justice nor perfect mercy. It is in fact the height of corruption.
Meaning that because human beings weren't able to keep the law like we said, Jesus would come down in person and ultimately keep the spirit of the Mosaic law, die on the cross, be the ultimate sacrifice for humanity, and rise again.
But how is it a sacrifice if he rises again? To sacrifice something is to give it up. That's why in the Old Testament, your sacrifices are supposed to be the best of what you own. Your unblemished sheep, the first fruits of your harvest, and all that. You are showing your commitment to God by giving up the best part of what you own. It's like when we had lasagna for dinner last night, and as I was dishing it out, I offered my partner the best bit where the noodles got a little crispy and the cheese was just ever so slightly burnt. I could have taken it for myself, but I gave it to her instead. That is a sacrifice. I could have had the best piece of lasagna in the pan, but I gave that up because I wanted to do something nice for someone that I care about. If there were another piece in the pan that was equally as good as the piece that I gave her, it would not have been a sacrifice on my part, because I'm not giving anything up by offering it to her. She gets a good piece, and I do as well. The sacrificial animal is supposed to die for your sin. If it came back to life a few days later and you now got to keep it, that's not a sacrifice, that's a minor inconvenience. And honestly, the sacrifice is supposed to be me giving up something. It's not about what the sacrificial animal would have wanted. It doesn't give up its life for you. You are giving up whatever products you would get from that animal. Wool, milk, meat, something to trade, those sorts of things. You can't use that animal for those purposes now because it has been sacrificed. So even if Jesus didn't end up as the most powerful being in existence at the end of it all, even if he really died for good, that's a sacrifice on his part, not mine. What did I lose out on in that transaction? Nothing at all. So using the logic that makes sacrifices work in the first place, how does that apply to me? Plenty of people throughout history have been executed in the exact same way, and they stayed dead. That is a much bigger sacrifice than the one that Jesus did, and they impacted my life to about the same degree. I didn't know them, so them dying didn't affect me. Sure, I can think about it and feel bad for them through empathy, but it's not the same as losing someone that I know. So aside from the fact that a religion grew up around Jesus, what's the difference between him dying on the cross and one of the tens of thousands of other people, many of them innocent, who were executed by the Romans in the exact same way? Well, if you believe in Christianity, the main difference is that Jesus didn't stay dead. The execution was what actually freed him from the shackles of humanity and allowed him to live his true God form again. So the sacrifice isn't a sacrifice on my part because I didn't give anything up when Jesus died, and it's not a sacrifice on his part because he not only didn't stay dead, but the act of dying is what allowed him to go back to being a god, making it closer to a reward than a sacrifice.
So what else does the New Testament say about the Old Testament law? Now, one of the most important places for us to look is in the writings of Paul. And this is because he was a teacher of the law before he became a follower of Jesus.
And he apparently had a big disagreement with Peter about the role the law would play in Christianity. Peter, the guy who Jesus said was the rock on whom his church would be built, thought that the law should still be followed. Paul disagreed and thought that it would make a better outreach to the Gentiles if they didn't need to worry about all those impossible Jewish laws. In the end, Paul won and became the rock on which Jesus' church would be built. Weird that Jesus was wrong about who would win that fight. Extra weird when you realize the whole Peter is the rock thing wasn't written down until after Paul wrote about his spat with Peter. Interestingly, though, the Peter is the rock on whom my church will be built thing is only found in one of the four Gospels, Matthew. Matthew is also where we find Jesus saying that he has not come to abolish the law, and that anyone who relaxes even the least of the commandments will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So, fun fact about Matthew, it appears to be written with a Jewish audience in mind. When it was written, Christianity was not its own religion. It was a sect of Judaism, and there was conflict among early Christians about whether the Gentiles should be targeted for evangelism, and to what extent. Matthew 15:10-20, when copying Mark's account of Jesus talking about what defiles a person from Mark 7:14-22, omits a key parenthetical. In Mark 7:18-19, it says, "And he said to them, Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean." The equivalent in Matthew 15 verses 16 and 17 says, "And he said, Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled, and ends without the thus he declared all foods clean bit?" Matthew also, in the part where Jesus sends the disciples out to evangelize, specifically tells them not to go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans, instead only going to the people of Israel. So given that there was a public disagreement between Peter and Paul, with Peter falling on the side of everyone who converts to Christianity has to follow the Mosaic law, and Paul falling more on the side of we won't get Gentile converts if we tell them they need to chop parts of their dicks off, so we can't make them follow the Mosaic law if we want this religion to actually grow, is it any wonder that the author who had a penchant for emphasizing the importance of Jewish laws and customs is also the one who sided with Peter in that dispute? So yeah, the Bible makes it quite clear in the book of Matthew that we are still bound by the Mosaic law, but the Bible also makes it quite clear in the book of Mark, and in several writings of Paul, that we are no longer bound to the Mosaic law. Seems like a bit of a catch-22, and one that an all-knowing being should have been able to avoid rather easily if he were actually in charge of putting the Bible together.
And he has unique insight that can actually help answer some of the questions that we're dealing with in this video. One of the most helpful passages comes from Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says that the law was created to help reveal the sin nature that each individual has.
And how does that work? Sin is when we humans break God's law. So if God had not made the law, we wouldn't be sinful, as there would be no law to break. So that means that God was in complete control of what would and would not count as sinful, so he could have written a law that was at least possible for us to keep, but he decided to design both us and the law in such a way that it would make it entirely impossible for us to keep the law, and then ordered us to keep the impossible law, with a punishment of eternal torture if we failed, which we all would, because he designed it to be impossible not to. And he did all this so that later on he could then do the whole Jesus thing in order to say, hey, ain't it nice that I'll not punish you for failing to do the thing that I made sure it was impossible for you to do if you believe in Jesus? I'm so good and merciful. Seems to me like an actual good and merciful God would make things in such a way that it's actually possible to follow the law, and then make it clear to everyone, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, what the law is and how to follow it.
Paul continues on in this pattern of thinking in Romans 7. He talked about while the law in and of itself isn't actually a bad thing, because without it, we wouldn't know that we were sinful, and thus we wouldn't realize our need for Jesus.
Let's read some of Romans 7, shall we? Romans 7, 7-9. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive, and I died. So, according to this, the very creation of the law is what condemned humanity to begin with. And yes, verse 6 does say that we are released from the law, serving in the new way of the Spirit and not the old way of the written code. But again, that just serves to emphasize that God could have not designed it this way from the start, and it highlights the fact that this design was not what was best for us, it was what was best for him to be able to show off to us.
The reality is, though, that the Mosaic law still leaves people in a difficult situation. What the Mosaic law does is it just tells you that you're breaking it. There's not really a plan for helping you live a better life where you stop breaking it.
Seems like a bit of a design flaw if you ask me.
However, in chapter 8 of Romans, Paul writes about how life in the Spirit, that is, life with Jesus, actually provides new life inside of us, allowing us to be able to walk closer with God.
Yep. Paul sure does justify not having to keep all the Jewish laws as part of his ministry to non-Jewish people for whom such a restriction would be a massive barrier to conversion. That's probably why, in the end, Paul's version of Christianity was the one that survived, while the Peter/Matthew version faded away. And this doesn't change the fact that the book we call the Bible doesn't agree with itself on this point, leaving us with the 3 contradictory Christian opinions on the matter that he mentioned at the beginning of the video.
You see, what we need to realize is that the law and the prophets are meant to point to the person of Jesus. They're a foreshadowing of what's going to come in the person of Christ.
So, as for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their clans that are with you, who have been born into your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. Points to Jesus, and that is a foreshadowing of what is to come in the person of Christ. Not a good look, if you ask me.
Jesus is the ultimate culmination of the Hebrew Scriptures, and his teachings that he will instill on earth will be transcendent above those of the Mosaic law.
Not according to Jesus, they wouldn't. They would add to them and make them stricter for the most part, but they don't transcend it. We still have the law. Again, according to the part in Matthew where he explicitly states that.
We see that in the later part of Matthew 5, when Jesus is doing his Sermon on the Mount. He's saying, you have heard that it was said, ... but I say unto you, ...
Oh, you're so close. Yes, and in the vast majority of those cases, he does not relax the law that he is talking about, but rather adds corollaries onto them to make them even harder to keep, with the turn the other cheek part being the primary exception to that.
What Jesus is doing in many of these cases is not only affirming the law, but revealing how high the bar of perfection actually is and what it means to be a true follower of God. What Jesus is doing here is clarifying and defining the law.
Yes, and not saying that you don't need to worry about following the letter of the law anymore, but affirming that not one jot or tittle shall pass from the law until the end of time. So no, you're not allowed to eat shellfish or wear mixed fabrics or be uncircumcised, unless you're reading in Paul's letters, in which case you are. And actually, if you get circumcised, that basically fucks you over, because now that means you do have to follow all of the laws, and Jesus' sacrifice doesn't work for you anymore. Galatians 5:2-4 says, "Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole of the law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace." It seems that even in the Jesus made it so we don't have to follow the law anymore camp, there's still a scenario where the law applies and must be followed to the letter.
Jesus then goes on to establish ground rules for the new covenant. So we have to ask ourselves then, what does the term new covenant mean?
It means the rules no longer apply. Carte blanche. Do all the sinning you want, and as long as you have a sincere repentance on your deathbed, you're golden. It's not how apologists will phrase it, but it is effectively how it works.
You see, Christians understand the new covenant to mean a new relationship between God and human, mediated by Jesus, upon sincere declaration that one believes in Christ as Lord and God.
Yeah, see? That's basically what I just stated, but in a way where its ridiculousness isn't as obvious.
Now, of course, there's some variances within this discussion. However, for the sake of our purposes in this video, that'll be fine.
Wait, hold up a minute. Why is that fine? Why would it be fine that Christians can't agree on one of the core aspects of Christianity? Especially since you framed it around having a relationship with God. If something confusing happens in my relationship with my partner, we can talk it through until it's sufficiently clarified. You say you have a relationship with God, and are saying that Christians don't even all agree on what that even means, and the guy you have a relationship with won't clarify that for you? That's taking the I don't like labels excuse to a whole new level.
So with that out of the way, we then ask, how can we be sure that we're part of the new covenant?
We can't all even agree on what it means to have a new covenant, so let's just ignore that and ask how we know we're a part of the new covenant. Do you not see the problem here? If you can't agree on what the new covenant even is, how can you possibly claim to speak with any authority on how to tell if you're a part of the thing that you can't agree on?
Well, in one story, Jesus is talking to a young man who asks him about this law of Moses, and Jesus responds that the greatest commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commands, the rest of the laws and the prophets hang.
And while that is certainly an improvement on the laws in the Old Testament, it is also demonstrably untrue. I've already read a section of the law regarding the keeping of slaves. Owning another human being as property is not loving your neighbor as yourself. Though, in the context of the Old Testament, neighbor would have been referring to fellow Hebrews rather than anyone else, so that's not necessarily a problem. But this does mean that this isn't the universal command that modern Christians like to pretend it is.
Now, when the young man hears this, he's excited because he says that he's done all of these things since he was a boy. And Jesus says that's good, but he challenges him to take it one step further by telling him to give everything he has to the poor and to follow Jesus.
Ah, yes. Now we get to the grift. Give the poor money. That's the only thing you can do to improve on the law. But, hey, isn't finding poor people just a little bit of a hassle? You know, so maybe just don't worry about that. Just give it to the church. Give us your money. That'll count as giving it to poor people. I mean, Daddy needs a new jet. Come on, we're poor. We'll help the poor, I promise. And, you know, while you're at it, just never you mind about that cemetery maintenance fund. Just don't even look into that.
And it's that last part that's worth looking at in depth. We have to ask ourselves the question, what does it mean to be a Christian in today's world? What rules do we need to follow?
And as you've already admitted multiple times, the answer to that question will depend on the personal opinion of whatever Christian you happen to direct that question at, which seems like a bad system if you ask me.
It's 3 steps. We love God, we follow Jesus, and we love others as ourselves. Now, it may seem like these are pretty simple things to understand. However, when you begin to look at them in depth, it makes sense how tough they actually are.
It really doesn't, though. Again, to refer back to things that you have said in this very video, God made things tough as a way for him to show off. It didn't have to be this way. He chose to make it this way, because he loves it when people recognize him for characteristics that he doesn't have, like justice and mercy, more than he cares about what's good for the sentient beings that he created.
See, when you read the Gospels, you see Jesus talking about raising the bar for being a real follower. To choose him, that's Jesus, above money, power, status, pleasure, importance, etc.
Yeah, that is again referencing the life of sacrifice that Christians are supposed to be living, but at least in North America, they're not.
To love our neighbor as ourselves, this means that we're willing to elevate the needs of others above our own conveniences, to go the extra mile for the people who have wronged us. We are to choose forgiveness over revenge.
Don't say that too loud. Christians in charge of most of the government in the States might come after you if you suggest that going after people isn't a Christian thing to do.
Put someone else's need above my need, my desire. To choose grace and mercy over judgment.
And this is where we come full circle back to where he was talking about Christians as being viewed as a bunch of people trying to impose rules that they don't follow onto other people. If you don't want Christians to be seen that way, then Christians should probably stop behaving that way.
To love God is to admit that we are in need of someone bigger than ourselves. To admit that we aren't able to do the right thing all the time on our own.
And who made us that way? He's already answered that. The law was designed to show just how poorly we were made. And that's it for this one. God's rules and rituals don't make any more sense now than they did at the beginning. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Random Potato Man 1305, who says, "Sin is separation from God, so if you live a sinful life and die in those sins, you go to hell because hell is total separation from God. I hope this helped you understand better, and God bless." Interestingly, this was on a short of mine where he didn't actually say anything about sin or hell. It was me asking why God allows Satan and the demons to have any amount of power whatsoever. I think it's actually quite telling when Christians respond to points that I haven't made instead of addressing the ones I do make. I'm sure that some of it is due to just regular old misunderstanding, but a lot of the time it'll be something like this, where it's not even a little bit related, so I don't actually know how you got there from what I said. So what I suspect is going on here is that when confronted with a problem with Christianity that they don't know how to deal with, they fall back to the apologetic for a problem that they do know, even if it's irrelevant to whatever is being discussed. I can't say for sure that that's what's going on. It could just be someone not paying the slightest bit of attention, but that is what it looks like to me. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the circumcision that negates the grace that is my channel. If you'd like to be required to follow all of the Old Testament laws to earn your salvation, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO Box address is in the description. See you next time! $5:15. Focus on me. Thank you.